All right. Hello. Good evening to our audience. We are going to get started right at 6 o'clock. I hope you guys enjoy today's panel on the next pandemic.
All right, so first off, we are going to start off with an introduction to the topic. And so this topic is on the next pandemic, and we're just going to be talking about what policies worked for this current pandemic and how we can improve upon health policy for any next pandemics or any future pandemics that happen. And so today we will have a wide variety of experts giving their opinion on what worked for this pandemic and what can be improved for next pandemics. We will have Dr. Nock, who is a PhD scientist and an immunology panelist. We will have Dr. Patrick Stevens, who is a zoonosis expert panelist. And we will have Miss Maddie Lewis, who is an infectious disease epidemiologist panelist.
I think you're on mute, Hayden. Okay, I apologize about that. So we're going to first start by going into the educational backgrounds and what qualifications make you a good fit for this panel. So if we could go through, we could start with Dr. Nock and then work through the panelists.
Sure. So my name is Morgan McSweeney. I do social media content in health and medicine under the handle at Dr. Nuck. My bachelor's of sciences in biomedical sciences from the University of Central Florida, which is sort of just a broad molecular microbiology training. And then my PhD was at UNC Chapel Hill studying pharmaceutical sciences, studying the immunology of responses against drugs, like unwanted antibody responses against drugs. And so got my PhD, then went on into biotech. Now I work in the development of monoclonal antibody-based therapeutics for respiratory infectious disease. So I was doing this even prior to the pandemic, working on treatments for things like influenza, RSV, other respiratory infectious pathogens. And now we're also working on some treatments for COVID. And then separately from that, also making social media content, which I started only at the beginning of the pandemic related to COVID vaccines, some other topics in science and medicine. And so dipping into sort of the public facing element, as well as the actual back end R&D on the science side.
Okay, cool. Would you like to share?
Hi, I'm Maddie Lewis. I also am from TikTok under at maddie.epidemiology. I got my Bachelor's of Arts degree in biology at University of Missouri, Kansas City. So I'm from Kansas City. And I minored in public health. And then I went directly from that undergrad experience to get my Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology at Emory University here in Atlanta. So I'm also in Georgia. And after graduating just this May, I started working at the Georgia EIP, which is the Emerging Infections Program. It's kind of hard to explain because it's kind of a federal, state, and nonprofit type of research organization. And I'm a surveillance epidemiologist, which means I keep track of diseases, to state that simply. And right now I'm doing Staph aureus, but I will be adding on more diseases once we get all caught up in Staph aureus in Atlanta. So yeah, that's me.
Cool. So would Dr. Stevens like to go next and explain himself?
Yeah, sure. So my PhD is actually in ecology and evolutionary biology. And when I first graduated, I didn't do any disease ecology at all. But my specialty and interest has always been in large scale ecological patterns and processes. And, and I eventually, discovered that one of the more interesting areas that I can work in is, focusing on large scale disease dynamics. And so that's become a larger and larger part of my research portfolio as I've gone on. I've been leading the macroecology of infectious disease research coordination network for about the last 7 years. That's a network. We have more than 50 collaborators focused on understanding large scale disease dynamics. We have people from more than a dozen countries and something like 20 20 different institutions. And we've published, I think we just passed 30 papers we've gotten out. I'm a member of the Center for the Ecology of Infectious Disease. I've been the chair of the Spillover Working Group for the last 2 years. Very recently, I've started working on risk factors for the spillover of African filoviruses, particularly Ebola in Africa.
Nice.
Oh, wait. I want to add one more thing. I'm sorry. I'm also the lead editor of a special issue of Phil Trans B that just came out, focused on disease macroecology. And I have a paper in there looking at the driver profile of the 100 largest zoonotic outbreaks in the last 30 years or so.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. Dr. Khan, would you like to introduce yourself and explain your educational backgrounds?
To Dr. Thapa.
So that's my turn? I thought you said Dr. Khan.
Dr. Thapa, if you could go next, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me well? I'm so sorry. I had to join from my phone. There is some network issues. But good evening, all of you. My PhD is in applied economics, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management in the College of Public Health. So since I'm from social science, I think I'll learn a lot today from all colleagues that are from more clinical and ecological side of things. My research is primarily on evaluating policies and programs or doing any secondary type of data to inform policy. So how can we inform future policy and programs is the primary area. My research focuses on chronic disease, both considering obesity, smoking, all lifestyle factors that are risk for chronic diseases. We are interested primarily in prevention, but treatment is important as well because obesity is so prevalent. I also direct the economic evaluation research group in the department, and recently we also have a policy and program evaluation research group. I'm a co-chair of that group as well. So I look forward to this session with you all.
Thank you so much for offering your introduction, Dr. Thapa, and we're so happy that you could join us today. So we're just going to jump right into our questions. So our first question is for Dr. Stevens, and we are just going to be asking, what is a zoonotic virus and what is the biggest factor that causes the spread of zoonotic viruses?
Sure. So a zoonotic virus is one that can be transmitted from an animal to a human. That's how it's generally defined. I particularly work on zoonotic viruses that can spread from wild animal populations into human populations. And in terms of what the factors are that cause them to spread, that was actually one of the things that we took a stab at with a very preliminary study that I just published about a week ago. And what we found was that large outbreaks that get into thousands up to hundreds of thousands of cases, the drivers that you see more often in them are sort of large scale drivers. So things like unusual weather conditions, changes in the abundance of vectors such as mosquitoes, and water contamination, sort of broad scale factors like that. And then another thing that we found was that large outbreaks, they tend to have more drivers, regardless of the drivers that you see in particular outbreaks. They tend to have a lot more proximate factors that contribute to them.
Thank you. Ms. Lewis, can you talk about the ways that viruses can spread between humans and other humans? We just talked about how they can spread from animals to humans, but can you talk about how it spreads within a community?
Yeah, I wish I had like my little notes up, but so for human to human transmission, there's respiratory transmission, which can be really worrisome, as we've seen with COVID. because you're constantly breathing and emitting those respiratory droplets and those aerosols, which are like the small version of respiratory droplets, into the environment. And, you know, people are very connected socially. So that's a very easy way to spread disease. And then there is the fecal oral route, which is usually how foodborne diseases spread. So that is what it sounds like. So because, you know, with hand washing and with poor sanitation, feces and like fecal matter can really be anywhere in the environment, and it can be really worrisome, like I said, with foodborne, because cooks and family members prepare food for multiple people, and that's how outbreaks can start there. What else is there? There's bloodborne and sexually transmitted diseases. So those are transmitted, of course, sexually, as well as like intravenous drug use and other practices that involve like blood with two people, like in hospitals. What else? I feel like I'm taking a test, but hopefully that answered your question. There's several others. So yeah, those are the main ones I can think about.
Thank you for offering your insight on that. I definitely agree. There's many different ways that viruses and diseases can spread between humans, but I think that with COVID, it was mainly respiratory droplets, like you mentioned, Miss Lewis. And so with that, we kind of talked about how diseases can be spread. The next question will be for Dr. Thapa, and this question is whether there were certain groups that were more severely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and kind of the reasons why these groups were more severely affected, and what policies can be created to help these groups that were affected adversely.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bisu. So early on, you know, last year, first couple of months after the COVID, we really saw that the ones where we were seeing you know, severe outcomes after infection, hospitalization, needing to be in the ICU, those were definitely with patients who had chronic condition and who were also elderly. But as we moved through the pandemic, we also found that even younger adults, not only older or above 65 adults, but even middle-aged population group who had chronic condition were more likely to have severe outcomes of infection. So what we are talking about here is severe outcomes of infection rather than infection. Infection is you know, there isn't a clear path, or at least where I couldn't claim right now. But if we look at severity of case, it is definitely among patients who have underlying health condition, you know, immune compromised, or have chronic condition. It could be you know, chronic pulmonary diseases. And so what we also know with chronic diseases, that individuals who have higher weight, who are obese, and you know, that is a risk factor for chronic disease. And so individuals who are obese were also likely to have severe outcomes. So what we have learned over more than a year of going through the pandemic is that before, when we were talking about infectious disease, investigators, researchers like me who was working in chronic disease, infectious disease is not my area. I work on chronic disease, would almost be the, how we looked at it. But over time, what we have learned is chronic disease is also a very high risk factor for chronic disease, infectious disease in case of COVID-19. So if you consider that and think of, okay, chronic, patients with chronic disease were more likely to have severe outcomes from COVID-19, where is chronic disease more prevalent? And with historically present health disparities in the country, certain racial groups, certain geographical location that had limited access to healthcare, limited access to healthy food, physical activity environment, those areas that were more vulnerable to having chronic condition or had a higher prevalence of chronic condition were also those that saw severe outcomes of COVID-19. And that is what we did in our most recent research to respond to COVID-19, was to identify geographical areas that were highly vulnerable and that saw higher infection rates and outcomes of COVID.
Thank you for explaining that about how the connection between chronic disease and infectious disease have a big hand in each other. Dr. Knott, can you talk about or explain a little bit about how different like variants and how those arise within a population or for a virus?
Yeah, for sure. So variants arise when there's mutations in the virus, and mutations can happen anytime the virus is replicating. They sort of just happen at a fixed rate while it's replicating inside your cells. Some of them help the virus, some of them don't help the virus. And the ones that do help the virus are more likely to be passed on and to take over the sort of infection landscape, which is what we saw originally with the Alpha variant or the UK variant originally, which then got replaced by the Delta variant. It's sort of, very basic evolutionary process where the ones that either infect people much more readily or evade the immune system better, or both, eventually take over. And so what you can do is some modeling of, there's a limited number of amino acids on the spike protein of the virus. And so to some extent, you can predict, you can play with those ahead of time and say, well, if this mutation arose, what would that do to evasion of the immune system? What that would do to an infectivity. And so to some extent, you can start to predict what could happen in the future with mutations. But what actually ends up happening is very much a matter of surveillance. And so that's where, we don't sequence all of the positive PCR results that come back as positives, because that's very expensive and laborious to do. But we do sequence a fraction of them. And so that's one area where we failed, certainly relative to the rest of the world for a long time. We were pretty slow in sequencing a substantial fraction of the variants that were coming back on positive PCR results. Sometimes that's not very actionable information anyway. Sometimes it is very actionable information, particularly when you're treating people with things like monoclonal antibodies, which can be very susceptible in terms of whether they work or not, depending on slight mutations, much more susceptible than vaccines are to different mutants that may arise. So we've been fortunate so far in that, for example, the Delta variant, the reason it took over is that people just shed a lot more virus. It's not necessarily much more evasive of your immunity. If you were vaccinated against, for example, the booster vaccines are still the same vaccines that we had a while ago. They didn't have to update the spike protein to account for the new mutations in the virus. There's just more virus being exhaled. And so to neutralize it, you need a correspondingly higher titer of antibodies in your mucus. And so getting the booster shot, even though it's the old spike protein, boosts your antibodies enough, it can tackle the virus. It is a little bit more immune evasive than the older versions of the virus, but not to a significantly worrisome extent. And so that's why we're seeing that even without the boost, people are still really well protected against really severe outcomes, hospitalization, and death. But then with the boost, they are additionally going to be better protected, even probably against mild to moderate disease.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. I felt like I was in a lecture for one of my classes. You're very well articulated. And we're actually going to open up to some audience questions now. We have a really great question, and Doc Nagis actually started talking about it a little bit, but what are some other panelists' opinions on how COVID was so specifically was so easily spread this time? So for example, Ms. Lewis, do you have any thoughts and opinions on this?
How it was so easily spread now or when it started?
Either or. You could elaborate on both aspects of it. That would be great.
Yeah, I'll talk about how COVID started. So when COVID started, to be honest, I was not surprised at all. The only thing that took me by surprise was how severe it was, because I just didn't expect like a shutdown. I expected something more like swine flu, right? Because that's what we're familiar with. But there's always emerging infections like all the time. There's in the last, 50 or so years, there's been HIV, Ebola, and several others. And so emerging infections are a very severe issue in public health. It's one of our biggest challenges. And our humans' interactions with animals are a huge aspect of these emerging infections. So I believe it's about 3/4 of emerging infections are zoonotic or zoonotic in origin. And because of just because of these interactions with animals through like agriculture, farming, or just the way we eat and consume food. And of course, we all know that the idea that COVID started was through like a wet market in China. And if you've ever like seen pictures of some of those wet markets, will have like meat sections, and some of them will have like major sanitary issues. And so it's really not surprising that viruses will like mutate and do funky things and evolve in that way with animals, and that will then like cross over to humans. So that's how I see how it started. I'm not surprised, and a lot of infectious disease experts are not surprised like by this either. A lot of the worry for a long time has been a influenza-like virus, or influenza-like illness is what we call them, which COVID is one of them. They're like respiratory viruses that kind of act and like seem like the flu, but they're all kind of different. And that has been a major worry in public health for a long time. Like CDC, people at CDC have been talking about that for years. And I know in my undergrad, my infectious disease professor was like, this is how the human species is going to end. Like it's going to be an influenza-like illness. And so yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you for that. I've definitely also had some professors tell me it's going to be the evolutionary arms race and it's a matter of time. This is my first year and I'm a fourth year now, so just sitting here right now, it's quite shocking. Thank you. Dr. Stevens, do you have any comments to add as our zoonotic expert? And potentially, there was actually another great question from the audience. Vedi asked, is there a particular time of the year where transmissions of zoonotic viruses are more likely?
Well, so on the first question, I will say, I don't think that anybody that works in this area was surprised that something like COVID came along. We knew it was just a matter of time. Now, I will say I was surprised at how easily transmittable it did turn out to be. And I was surprised by the apparent mortality rate very early on. So some of the details were surprising, but something like that happening, we all knew it was just a matter of time. In terms of time of the year, I'm not a flu expert, so I'm going to be talking out of the side of my head a little bit. But my understanding is that transmission rates in the winter are much higher because people tend to be indoors a lot more. And then there's also some thinking that perhaps environmental conditions during the summer make flu transmission a little bit less likely. But I would say, the time of the year when transmission is most likely, it probably also depends on the particular pathogen that you're going to be talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about like a foodborne illness, I could imagine that transmission rates might be higher in the summer because people are going to picnics a lot. And so I don't think it's probably a one-size-fits-all answer.
All right, awesome. And then we have another great question asking, do you believe that the COVID, and I'm going to ask for Dr. Tampa to provide her input first. Do you believe that the COVID-19 virus will become similar to the flu in the future, and where people are encouraged to get vaccinated every year, especially as new variants form?
So first, to the previous question, I wanted to add that one thing that's peculiar, not peculiar with just COVID, but influenza-like zoonotic diseases is they transfer through respiratory droplets, right? So I think that was one of the key factor on how quickly it spread. Definitely, not to forget about that, unlike others that need bodily fluid exchange or sexually transmitted, things like that. For this one, it is, respiratory transmitted. And I think that ties in with the most recent question as well. Again, I don't want to forecast the future, but looking at where we are now, we definitely know that science is there. We have seen evidence. Vaccination is how we we control these type of outbreaks. And there is masking to prevent exchange of bodily fluids. How much of immune that will kick in, vaccine helped in our own immune with how it will develop. I cannot say, but I do, personally, not science oriented here, but I do see once these outbreaks are there, unless all of us are vaccinated and are able to get herd immunity as quickly as possible, it will be here to stay, and we will see more variants come in. For some of, historically, we have done a really good job in public health with controlling many of the outbreaks, like smallpox. There is all the vaccinations that we take. We have been able to control outbreaks, but I think that is because of where we were. Maybe it didn't take as much time. Again, I have to do my research, but I think the sooner we get herd immunity, the sooner people get, we all get vaccinated, the easier it would be to get it under control. But the way we are, even, talking about on home state, where UGA is, our complete vaccination rate is under 50%. And we are already almost 2 years with COVID being around. The first vaccine came out, the emergency authorization was in December, mid-December for health professionals, and December is already around the corner, and we are still at lower than 50%. So that does make me nervous, and on how new variants may keep coming in, because our vaccination rate is just low. Would it have been different? Maybe our future would have been different.
And Dr. Thapa and maybe Maddie Lewis, can you put your input on to like health disparities within the vaccination rate, and what's your opinion on that?
Absolutely. So since I'm going, I'll just continue, and Maddie, you can jump in anytime. What we also saw in our research was that severe outcome of, or more specifically, death as a result of COVID-19 was also higher in Rust Belt, which is around Lake Michigan area, where a lot of industrial development happened, and their air pollution is higher than other areas. South is called the chronic belt, the stroke belt, where we have higher rates of obesity, the highest rate of obesity in the state of Mississippi. Georgia ranked 17th, but all in other states in South, we are at the higher ranking for obesity. As a result, so South is we call stroke belt, chronic belt. Then there is the Rust Belt, which is around Lake Michigan. And when we saw in our own result is that there is definitely regional variation in where, how we looked at was we identified counties that were high vulnerable and low, moderate or low vulnerable. And then we looked at case incidence of COVID-19 and then mortality due to COVID-19. So we definitely see regional clustering of incidents around the South, around Lake Michigan area. So that being said, there is clearly health disparity in infection, but then these are also the areas that have historically lacked access to healthcare. So to your point of vaccination, there are two ways we could think about it. One is the hesitancy aspect, when vaccine is available and yet people are resistant to get vaccinated. The other is vaccine not being available. So I think both of these will play a role. And there is also historical evidences of how health research was done that may have influenced hesitancy for certain racial groups. So I don't know, there isn't a clear answer. There are different ways we have to look at it, but we certainly, this pandemic has brought more to our attention social determinants of health and existing health disparities, and how it is so important to address them for no matter if we are talking about chronic disease or infectious disease, or talking about vaccination. To get vaccine uptake at the rate we want to be, we need to address those social determinants health for all for whatever the goal may be. So there is, disparities has definitely, it had our attention, but now it has had even more attention, even from colleagues who are working in infectious disease.
Thank you. Ms. Lewis, can you put in your input on that and like how it will be effective in the future to like future diseases?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about racial and ethnic disparities with the vaccine distribution in the United States. So nothing about this pandemic in general, vaccines and infections, is really any different than what we see in general in the health and the public health in the United States, to where minority, like ethnic and racial groups, typically see like worser outcomes, lower rates of vaccination, etc. So when it comes to Black, Hispanic people in the United States, they do have lower vaccination rates than white people, especially compared to the amount of infections that those populations have. And so that's just not super surprising. And there's several different reasons why this disparity exists. So I'm not going to name all of them because I don't know all of them. But one of the reasons is vaccine hesitancy. And that is when someone is like hesitant or like refuses to get a vaccine, or it's just like delaying it. And there's so many different reasons why we see vaccine hesitancy, specifically in different racial and ethnic groups. Some of the reasons are like historical mistreatment in the medical system. And that's a big problem going on right now. And another reason for these disparities is access to healthcare and access to like the vaccine. So ideally in the United States, we keep pushing for better access, getting this vaccine in all like the Walgreens and the CVS's and just like anywhere remote. But some people still live in these really remote areas in the United States. I don't think some people realize that we do have extreme poverty and some in the United States, like you would see in like Africa or Asia or South America. Like we have that extreme poverty here too. And some people live in really remote areas such as reservations or the Appalachian Mountains. And it's really hard to access healthcare facilities and access the vaccine. So those are some of the reasons why we see some of those disparities. And then what was your second question?
How do you think that will be affected in the future? Or how do you think we can like change that to be better in the future?
Yeah, I think the only way we can change these disparities are to be very intentional. We can't just ignore them and acknowledge them. We actually have to come up with strategies. And those strategies, in my opinion, need to come from people in these communities who actually understand and know and are familiar with why people can't get the vaccine or why they don't want to or why they're hesitant. Getting that knowledge and finding those strategies from people in those communities, like from the source, is always going to be the most effective strategy to make a change in public health. So yeah.
I sorry, just wanted to add to that question. I want to make sure I share the evidence that I recall. Up until July, I recall there was a Kaiser Permanente research. And on that research, the group that had the highest vaccine hesitancy was middle-aged white men. So I think it is based on data. We cannot apply one here is where the vaccine hesitance group is across US. Maybe it is different across geographical locations also. I didn't want our session here to come out as vaccine hesitancy is in a certain racial group. So we definitely have seen the evidence are scattered and we are still seeing it. But I also your question reminded me of another research that we did in using influenza vaccine data from behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which is the largest health risk survey in the US. And what we found was high risk groups, high risk being either So we categorized high risk as being obese or having chronic condition, or smoking, or individuals who smoke and are obese, or individuals who smoke and have chronic conditions. So we defined high risk groups that way. And what we found was high risk groups were most likely to get their influenza vaccines from doctor's office, followed by stores. So stores meaning superstores or pharmacies. And to that is what we see is, so the most preferred location for vaccination, at least for flu vaccine, is doctor's office. But given the supply infrastructure that is needed for COVID-19 vaccine, it needs to be stored at a certain temperature, and doctor's office are not able to stock vaccine as much as we wanted to. So there are several reasons why we will see disparity in uptake, even not accounting for hesitancy. And then there is the hesitancy piece that is present and important.
Yes, definitely. Vaccine hesitancy is a huge issue across the country. It just seems like a big reason for this pandemic continuing is the fact that so many people are hesitant to get the vaccine. And so this next question goes to Dr. Stevens. Do you have a strategy for increasing vaccination rates across the country? And how can we kind of convince people, a greater proportion of the population, to receive the COVID vaccines?
I wish I had a good answer for that, because I mean, one thing that's clear to me, both because of what we're going through now, but also for my research, is that one of the biggest challenges in making outbreaks less severe, lessening the chance of large outbreaks, is getting people to use the tools that we already have. So, for example, this really surprised me, and the data I'm talking about here, it includes a lot of small outbreaks too. So outbreaks that, there were maybe a few dozen cases at most, and then we got them under control. But when we looked at outbreaks overall, food contamination played some kind of a role in almost half of all outbreaks in our data set. We sampled across a bunch of different diseases. And so to me, I mean, that indicates something that's very, eminently preventable. Sort of the same way that what we're going through now. I mean, this second wave of COVID, we did not have to be going through this. We have good vaccines. It's eminently preventable. And so what I'm really increasingly beginning to appreciate is that one of the major challenges of our times is how to depoliticize, I guess, these interventions that we have available, and just get more people to use them. Another example from my research, early on, we're doing a better job at controlling Ebola outbreaks more recently. And one of the things that proved to be really key for that was actually bringing anthropologists on the research team so that they could figure out the cultural factors that were lessening uptake of control strategies, and that were making it harder for healthcare workers to communicate with people and let them do their jobs. And so, I think thinking more about socioeconomic factors and cultural interactions, I think, and sort of communicating with people on terms that they're willing to accept, I think is going to be really critical. And it's something that we really need to think seriously about.
Okay, awesome. Doc Knock, would you mind adding your input onto this as well? That'll be great.
Yeah, and so one way that my thinking has changed on this over the course of the pandemic is that vaccine misinformation and hesitancy is not entirely accidental. Some of it is very intentional, actually. We have very clear evidence, for example, that Russia intentionally spreads misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccines, both to discredit, the mRNA vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and to promote their own COVID-19 vaccine. And they do this in sort of very sneaky ways with making accounts on social media, spreading misinformation, promoting videos. I was speaking with someone from the Center for Countering Digital Hate who's done quite a lot of research into how vaccine misinformation spreads. And it turns out there's a very small number of people who are responsible for generating, originally they literally sit around and they plan vaccine misinformation to target specific groups. So they'll say, okay, we want to target Muslim immigrants in the United States. What type of misinformation can we come up with? And how do we tell the narrative and how do we promote it through social channels to get these people to not trust the vaccines? And then we sell them, various products. It's a huge source of profit for some of these, and some of the biggest anti-vaxxers at the top. And so it's a very intentional process and they're very savvy. They're extremely good at what they do on social media, much more so, I would say, than, traditional public health channels. You don't see the CDC on TikTok, for example. You may hear radio advertisements from the CDC that say, good news, there's now COVID vaccines, they're safe and effective. And that's the end of the advertisement, which everyone knows already. In contrast, the misinformation evolves extremely rapidly, sometimes on the order of days or on the order of weeks. And to keep up with it, a public health agency would have to be much more nimble, I think, than they have the capacity right now to do. Getting the approvals to come up with social media content as the CDC or as the World Health Organization, you make a draft, you get it approved by someone, you write the script or something, it could take you a week or a couple of weeks or something to make that content. And by then the misinformation has already done its damage. And so to some extent, these groups that are targetedly weaponizing misinformation, either for political gain on a state, nation versus nation level, or, on a party versus party level, the weaponization of anti-science misinformation really started to become more prevalent in around 2015. At the time, it was associated more fringely with like QAnon types of movements. It started to become, though, particularly with the onset of the pandemic, it started to become a more mainstream aspect of some right-leaning parties. And so as a direct result of that, we see vast differences in vaccination uptake on the basis of people's political leanings, which wouldn't make any sense theoretically. The scientific data that we have is the same scientific data for everyone. So theoretically, you should see no difference in red versus blue political leaning people who live in a similar geography. And that's hard to reverse because people take that on almost as part of their identity at that point. It's not something, a lot of matters in science and health and medicine, people don't care about the evidence for clinical trials for cardiovascular medications. They're not going to passionately debate you about, new cancer drug clinical trial results. But they might passionately debate you about the validity of ivermectin as a prophylactic for COVID-19. They wouldn't do that for any other drug in the world, but they've taken it on as a part of their identity. And when it gets down to that deeper level, that's really hard to pull apart. And so countering that is going to require not just work on the public health standpoint. Clearly, there needs to be involvement at the level of, state departments, at the level of people interfacing with private companies. I think social media companies have a responsibility to try to curb some of the misinformation where it can be shown that it's directly likely to harm people. And these are very extremely challenging things to do. The World Health Organization is trying to do so. They're pulling together, YouTube and Facebook and TikTok, and they're saying, look, we have very clear evidence that there is a lot of content that is simply factually incorrect, that is scaring people away from things that have clear data showing that it would help their health. And they're trying to get the companies to, move in that direction, but it's a slow process.
Thank you so much for your input. And actually, since you're already speaking, I'd like you to answer another audience question. I'm going to open this up to the rest of the floor. How likely, and this might be difficult to answer because if we knew the answer to this, then we wouldn't be in the situation, but how likely would it be to have another pandemic just like this shortly after the end of COVID?
Could easily happen. It may even be more likely to happen prior to the pandemic, and even for the first few weeks of the pandemic, we sort of had a cohesive, everyone was in this, we're going to lock down for 2 weeks to slow the spread or something. Since then, we do have this vast polarization that's happened. And so maybe we're in a good point right now in that we've had ramping up of, PCR test throughput and sequencing throughput. We could probably make an mRNA vaccine really quickly for another pathogen that were to emerge. And so I think it's hard to say the timeline for when it would occur. And to some extent, we can look, for example, at influenza rates last year, maybe even this year. The fact that we've seen lower rates of infectious disease sort of generally across the board, maybe they're picking up now as people are going back to normal better, maybe that temporarily puts a lower risk of the emergence of a new pandemic, just sort of like because people are being more cautious generally. But there's nothing to say it couldn't happen, or that it couldn't happen and be twice as infectious as COVID or twice as deadly as COVID. And so, I think we probably all think it's going to happen eventually at some point, probably even eventually with another coronavirus at some point. It might be in 20 years, it might be in 2 years, it might be in 100 years. That part's quite hard to say.
Would anybody else like to?
Yeah, so I'd like to chime in. There's been a lot of research, for example, a classic study that was published by Kate Smith in 2014 that showed that the number of outbreaks seems to be increasing over time. So these zoonotic outbreaks and outbreaks in general are increasing in frequency. We looked specifically at large outbreaks. We built a large data set of about 4,500 global outbreaks from all over the world that we could assign case numbers to. And we looked at just the large ones, outbreaks with more than 100 cases or outbreaks with more than 1,000 cases. And the frequency of those seems to be increasing over time as well. And so, I mean, nobody has any idea how long it's going to be, before we get another event like H1N1 or like COVID that we're going through now. But there's every reason to think that the frequency of those kinds of events is going to increase over time, at least, until we get a better handle on it.
Thank you for explaining that. So I had one question about the flu season and COVID. I know that was like a kind of topic that we talked about last year, but I feel like we're kind of getting into that again. So could Dr. Knott, could you explain about what would it look like? Could you get the coronavirus or COVID-19 and the flu like at once, or could those be like together?
Yeah, you mean the infection? You could be infected with both at the same time, which would be uncomfortable. It would not necessarily be dramatically more risky than getting them serially, like back to back. It could definitely, it's pretty unlikely to happen, but it can happen. And people also can be infected with 2 different variants of coronavirus at the same time, for example. We have some clear sequencing data showing that. So the twin-demic that people talk about with COVID and influenza is less on the individual scale in terms of having both at the same time. It's more on the population scale in terms of in a bad flu season, you can have pretty full hospitals anyway, like pre-COVID. And so when you add on to that the morbidity of COVID, you end up with stretching of resources. And so that's the main concern of the twin-demic of influenza and COVID, rather than individually increased risk if you happen to get both. And that can be largely addressed, if people get their influenza vaccines and their COVID vaccines, and we have a treatment for influenza. Now we have increasing access to treatments for COVID. And so, like Dr. Stevens was saying, if we make use of those tools, it doesn't have to be that bad. If we don't make use of those tools, it can be extremely bad. And so a lot of the challenge, it's 2 parts. One, making the tools, which is what we've been doing for the past 18, 19 months. Second part, getting people to use those tools, which is almost equally challenging, if not more challenging in some cases.
Thank you for explaining that and talking a little bit into that. Ms. Lewis, can you talk about that on like a public health side of it and epidemiologist look?
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Yeah, so we were just talking about how how COVID-19 and how the flu could like spread at the same time or be in a person at the same time with like a co-infection. Could you talk about how like how the flu season works maybe, and how the coronavirus or how COVID-19 has affected that, or what that could look like into the future?
Outside of what Dr. Knock just mentioned, and this is kind of not answering the question, but I do want to say I'm interested to see if the vaccines for COVID and flu will ever be combined and like how that would work. Because for other vaccines, we have multiple different viruses or multiple different like pathogens, diseases, whatever, into one vaccine. So I don't know, Dr. Nock, do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, I think Moderna is currently testing a combined vaccine for both. I think a couple of people are as well. You can do it in one shot, or you can do it in 2 shots close to each other. I think it will be available. Some people don't want one or the other though. So I think you still will have access to them separately, but I do think there probably will be a combined product.
It's good to know.
Yes, I definitely agree. And so actually, this kind of ties in with our next question that we have. So why are many emerging diseases zoonotic? Is it just because humans are in increasing contact with animals, or are there other reasons as to why there are so many emerging diseases that are zoonotic? And Dr. Stevens, could you offer your insight on this question?
Yeah, sure. It's a lot of things. Human population density increasing in tropical areas that have lots of mammalian and avian hosts that diseases could jump into us from. Encroachment. So for example, areas of deforestation are areas of high risk of Ebola spillover. And it's just because humans are coming into contact with animals more often in those areas. Also, when you convert land for certain kinds of agriculture, that can produce transmission opportunities. And so it's a combination of things, but it's really human demographic change, I would say, and the way that we are interacting with the environment. As well as globalization, obviously, and just increased travel of people all around the world are all, it's kind of a perfect storm of different factors.
Yes, I completely agree. There's definitely a lot more factors in the world. I know the world is changing. It's becoming more globalized. So that definitely affects the emergence of zoonotic diseases. And so to Dr. Thapa, I would like to ask, what are some policies that worked this pandemic that can be utilized for a future zoonotic disease pandemic?
Okay, so one of the key focus for us has been thinking of equity and equality. So for most of the policies that we see, they are federal policies or there are state policies, but where our research has focused on more is identifying that there may be a policy present at the state level, but do counties, for example, have the same resource to implement the policy equally? And the answer to that we know is no. So what we have been focusing on, at least in my little corner, is that it has to be equity focused first, and we need to get more resources in places that has historically not received those resources. So that is kind of the general answer to your question on what might the policy look like. But beyond that is, we have always spoken about for example, Medicaid expansion is a good policy example where people who do not have access to healthcare had the opportunity to have access to healthcare through Medicaid expansion after Affordable Care Act, but not all states have expanded Medicaid. Why is this important? Because it limits access of people to health when they do not have health insurance. And factors such as that can have rippling effect on delaying treatment, right? And when people are not getting treatment in a timely manner, the more likely they are to infect more or to be in a state of ill health. And health is a societal product. So if someone is not well, then the chances of spreading and causing the community to be ill increases. So there such as policies such as those. And the other very important thing that has come out after the pandemic, it came out as a need, is to extend telehealth, right? And for even for states that were not prepared to expand telehealth because of COVID-19, states had to switch to telehealth. So maybe there are instances of where it may not have worked, and we still have to learn more of the best practices in telehealth and what worked and what did not work. But I think the pandemic allowed us to know more about the feasibility of telehealth. And for example, in the state of Georgia, we have a broadband expansion program to allow individuals who historically did not have access to healthcare to now be able to access healthcare through telehealth. And we are seeing more and more innovations around the space of telehealth. So I think from where I am, policies such as that increases access to healthcare services are what we will need to continue seeing to address pandemics like this in the future, and even this one as we move forward.
Thank you so much for your insight, Dr. Thapa. And I'd actually like to add on, do Ms. Lewis or Dr. Nock have anything to add to the discussion on kind of what the policies that worked for this pandemic that can be used for future pandemics?
Yeah, I can add on one thing. And this isn't super prevalent yet in this pandemic, but vaccine mandates, in my opinion, are one of the best ways to expand vaccine coverage. So in the United States currently, all 50 states have vaccine mandates for school children K through 12. And COVID is not on the schedule currently. And I do think that in a couple years it will be, but we will see. And it depends on the state. And the other vaccine mandate that's most popular in the United States is workplace vaccine mandates, which are typically in healthcare facilities, so hospitals, doctors' offices, and just healthcare and nursing homes, and just healthcare providers in general. So we don't have too much of that yet. We do have some workplace vaccine mandates depending on the company, but we don't really have any for school children because we're still waiting for emergency use approval or authorization, and then, full approval from the FDA. So it might take a while because a lot of states will probably wait for full approval, I think. So yeah, that's one thing I really think we have to take with us for future pandemics, as long as we can have a vaccine for that pathogen in the future.
Yeah, and then two things to add, even at the earlier stage, even pre-vaccine, something that's really powerful, particularly in the groups that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, are economic incentives. And so one thing that we've done correctly is making, when we eventually got to it, is making tests widely available and making them free. That should have happened much sooner. We should have invested much more heavily, even though it would have been expensive, into rapidly scaling up rapid testing and even just PCR testing. Going back to something we spoke about at the very beginning in terms of why this spreads so much, is for a while we didn't realize how infectious it was, even among people who didn't have symptoms, either because they were pre-symptomatic or because they would stay asymptomatic. And sort of the only way that you're going to counter that is if you have widespread testing available and people are just getting tested serially, every week or however often you can afford to do it. And then if they come up as a positive test result, if they have no symptoms, it can be very helpful to provide economic packages to let them stay home from going to work. People who need to go to work to support their families, if they don't have symptoms and you're not going to pay them anything for it, it's very hard to convince them to not go to work, which is very bad in terms of exponential, spread of disease, particularly because people in forward-facing jobs like that tend to be in contact with good numbers of people as part of their job. And so for the next time, I think we can't be afraid to invest pretty heavily, very rapidly in scaling up testing, production, and availability, and then providing economic packages to people who do test positive to stay home, which we eventually did, but would have been better faster.
All right, thank you so much for that. We only have about 2 minutes left, unfortunately. So Dr. Stevens, do you have any last minute comments you'd like to share? And then Dr. Thapa, any last minute comments of yours? Oh, I think you're muted, by the way.
No,
so I think that I mean, from this conversation, I think it kind of reinforces we really need to think better about how to get people to use the tools that we have. We can have the best tools in the world, and if half the country isn't willing to use them or aren't willing to let healthcare workers do their job, we're still going to have a really big problem.
Echoing Dr. Stephen's comment, and this reminds me of a conversation I had with a colleague who is a medical doctor, and he was talking about how it's now been a debate between ethics and the availability of resources to provide service. Ethically, everyone should be provided healthcare services, but if the healthcare resources are being used by individuals who have avoided evidence-based vaccine and then made resources unavailable for those who are vaccinated, then that becomes an ethical question too, right? So to me, I think bottom line is we know the tools, as you said, Dr. Stephens, available that vaccination work. The more we can do to promote vaccinations as we play a role in our own professional lives related to health outside in the community and where we live. I think that's the message we need to get our tools utilized that we know work.
I think that's a really wonderful point to leave off of. Thank you so much, Dr. Thapa. And with that, it is actually just now 7 p.m. So thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to our moderators and everybody backstage for hosting this. And thank you, lastly, to our audience. We've consistently had about 70 to 80 participants for the whole duration of the stream. So to our audience and to our panelists, I hope you guys have a really great rest of your night.